One Nation Under Blackmail. The sordid union between intelligence and crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein. Volume 1. Copyright 2022 Whitney Webb. All rights reserved. Excuse me, Miss Webb, but I consider this to be too important to not read it and make it public on YouTube. Alright, we will not go into the publisher's foreword. No, we will start here with the introduction. Volume 1. The July 2019 arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and his subsequent death that August brought national as well as international attention to a sex ring where certain members of the power elite sexually abused and exploited female minors and young women. Epstein's death, officially ruled a suicide, has been treated skeptically by many for a variety of reasons. Regardless of the real circumstances of his death, it has led to scores of Americans embracing the view that his death was both intentional and necessary to protect his powerful co-conspirators and the full extent of his covert and illegal activities. Even if one chooses not to entertain such disconcerting possibilities, it is quite apparent that most of those who aided or enabled Epstein will never see the inside of a prison cell. Though Ghislaine Maxwell is now serving a 20-year sentence, others known to have been intimately involved in his illegal activities continue to enjoy protection from the so-called sweetheart deal, or plea deal, that followed Epstein's first run-in with the law for his sex trafficking activities in the mid-2000s. In addition, Ghislaine Maxwell's recent trial saw information involving third parties redacted, leading many to believe that the public will never know the names of the Johns or clients who benefited from the sex trafficking activities of Epstein and Maxwell and who were potentially blackmailed by them. Yet, for both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, there's much more to the story. This became apparent when this became apparent when it emerged that Alex Acosta, then serving as Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration, had disclosed to the Trump transition team that he had previously signed off on Epstein's sweetheart deal because Epstein, quote, had belonged to intelligence, quote end. Acosta, then serving as U.S. Attorney for Southern Florida, had also been told by unspecified figures at the time that he needed to give Epstein a lenient sentence because of his links to intelligence. When Acosta was later asked if Epstein was indeed an intelligent asset in 2019, Acosta chose to neither confirm or deny the claim. Other hints of a connection between Epstein and intelligence subsequently emerged, with reporting from a variety of sources that Epstein was affiliated with the CIA, Israeli intelligence, or both. Despite the implications and significance of these connections to intelligence, most of mainstream media declined to dig deeper into these claims, instead largely focusing on the salacious aspects of the Epstein case. The narrative soon became that Epstein was an anomaly, the sole mastermind of an industrial sex trafficking enterprise and a talented con artist. Even his closest associates and benefactors, like retail billionaire Leslie Wexner, have been taken at their word that they knew nothing of Epstein's crimes, even when there is considerable evidence to the contrary. Indeed, it was later stated by Cindy McCain, wife of former Senator John McCain, that, quote, we all knew what he was doing, quote end, at an event in January 2020, where she also claimed that authorities were afraid to properly apprehend him. If he was such an anomaly and a standalone con artist, how was he single-handedly able to intimidate the law enforcement apparatus of an entire nation for decades? The claim that Epstein did not have powerful backers and benefactors stands on incredibly shaky ground. Excuse me. Oddly enough, mainstream reporting on Epstein was once relatively open about his alleged intelligence ties, with British media reporting as early as 1992 and throughout the early 2000s that Epstein had ties to both US and Israeli intelligence. In addition, also in the early 1990s, Epstein's name was mysteriously dropped from a major investigation into one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, even though he was labeled the mastermind of that swindle in grand jury testimony. Around the same time, subsequently released White House visitor logs show that Epstein visited the Clinton White House 17 times, accompanied on most of these visits by a different, attractive young woman. Reporting on those visitor logs was largely done by a single media outlet, Britain's The Daily Mail, with hardly any American mainstream media outlets bothering to investigate these revelations about Epstein and the former US president. Why was Epstein so heavily protected from justice for decades, in connections to both his sex trafficking crimes and his financial crimes? Why have the once commonly reported intelligence connections of Jeffrey Epstein now been relegated to, quote, conspiracy theory, quote, end, despite evidence to the contrary? If powerful senators knew what Epstein was doing to young women and girls, who else knew, and why wasn't something done? This two-volume book endeavors to show why Jeffrey Epstein was able to engage in a series of mind-boggling crimes for decades without incident. Far from being an anomaly, Epstein was one of several men who, over the past century, have engaged in sexual blackmail activities designed to obtain damaging information, i.e. intelligence, on powerful i.e. intelligence on powerful individuals, with the goal of controlling their activities and securing their compliance. Most of these individuals, including Epstein himself, have their roots in the covert world where organized crime and intelligence have intermingled and often cooperated for the better part of the last 90 years, if not longer. Perhaps most shockingly, these men are all interconnected to various degrees. Following the formal establishment of the organized crime intelligence World War II through what is today remembered as Operation Underworld, the relationship between these two entities has since become so intertwined and so symbiotic that today it is nearly impossible to know where one ends and the other begins. As this book will show, many of the biggest scandals and events of the last century have not only been tied to these networks, but many of them also have counted with the involvement of sex traffickers and blackmailers, Epstein among them. Publicly, these men have been powerful lawyers, businessmen, and lobbyists. Their more clandestine and shadowy activities, though a matter of record, are often known only to those who are well read on certain historical events or in the field of deep politics. In order to understand Jeffrey Epstein and his activities in their full context, one must understand his powerful contacts to the structures that protected him. Those structures and those networks did not begin with Jeffrey Epstein, and they also did not die with him. In revealing his broader milieu and that of his past associates and clients, one is left not only with a damning indictment of Jeffrey Epstein, but a damning indictment of American institutions, particularly those involved in national security matters and law enforcement. We cannot properly address the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, nor prevent them being committed by others in the future, unless we grapple with the covert power structures that have long wielded blackmails, bribes, and assassinations as their weapons of choice to corrupt and control public institutions while manipulating and looting the public. Jeffrey Epstein was not an anomaly, and his activities represent just the tip of the veritable iceberg. Whitney Webb, 14th of August, 2022. Now follows something here from the former CIA officer and Iran-Contra whistleblower Bruce Hemmings around 1990. So, this is a quote of this guy. Who are these people? They are the group that is Who are these people? They are the group that is popularly called the Enterprise. They are in and outside the CIA. They are mostly right-wing Republicans, but you find a mix of Democrats, mercenaries, ex-officio, mafia, and opportunists within the group. They are CEOs, they are bankers, they are presidents, they own airlines, they own national television networks. They own 6 of the 7 video documentary companies of Washington, D.C., and they do not give a damn about the law or the Constitution or the Congress or the oversight committees except as something to be subverted and manipulated and lied to. They abhor sunlight and law of darkness. They deal in innuendo and character assassination and planted stories, the incomplete thought and sentence. They burn and shred files if caught. They commit perjury, and when caught, they have guaranteed sinecures, with large U.S. corporations. If you let them, they will take over not only the CIA, but the entire government and the world, cutting off dissent, free speech, a free media, and they will cut a deal with anyone from the mafia to Saddam Hussein if it means more power and money. They stole 600 billion from the SNLs and then diverted our attention to the Iraqis. They are ripping off America at a rate never before seen in history. They flooded our country with drugs from Central America during the 1980s, cut deals with Haro in Mexico, Noriega in Panama, and the Medellin and Cali cartels, and Castro, and recently the Red Mafia in the KGB. They ruin their detractors, and they fear the truth. If they can, they will blackmail you. Sex, drugs, deals, whatever it takes. Quote end. This was from a former CIA officer and Iran-Contra whistleblower Bruce Hemmings, circa 1990. Okay, now we finally start. Chapter 1. The Underworld of Spies and Crooks. At 2:30 in the afternoon of February 9th, 1942, a fire broke out on board the Normandy, a ship that was then in the process of being converted into a troop transporter in New York City's harbor. As the flames roared, winter winds fanned the flames, spiraling the fire up and then down onto the ship's top decks. Within hours, the Normandy began to lean to her port side, weighed down by the water that was being dumped onto the boat by fire crews. Soon the ship capsized and an expensive, unprecedented salvage operation was mounted. Despite these efforts, repairing the ship was soon found to be too complicated and too costly, and the Normandy was scrapped in 1946. Investigations into the destruction of the Normandy quickly revealed that the cause of the disaster had been incompetence and carelessness. Yet, nevertheless, rumors grew that it had been the work of German saboteurs, who were, by the way, I'm German, so if my English is not perfect, please excuse me, the German saboteur, who were intent on disrupting America's early war efforts. Proponents of these theories argued that the alleged saboteurs sought to break down the country's logistical capabilities through attacks in ports and harbors, as well as factories and other strategic industrial locations. William B. Hurland, the then New York Commissioner of Investigation, summed up the spirit of the times when he said, quote, "We are faced with a grave national emergency. A blackout was imposed over the waterfront area within the 3rd Naval District, which included New York and New Jersey. Many of our ships were being sunk by enemy submarines off the Atlantic coast, and the outcome of the war hung in the balance." Quote end. Management and regulation of these critical harbors and coastlines was the responsibility of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the ONI. An ONI inquiry was opened in May 1942 into potential saboteurs and Nazi agents operating in the ports and the possibility of U-boat movements off the East Coast. The man tasked with overseeing this inquiry was C. Radcliffe Haffenden. Several of the agents assigned to work under Haffenden had previously worked with Thomas E. Dewey, the U.S. State Attorney who later served as governor of New York. Dewey was best known for his prosecution of organized crime, and through these contacts, Haffenden learned of the role played by gangsters and other criminal elements on the New York City waterfront. Dewey's chief of staff, attorney Frank Hogan, suggested to Haffenden and the ONI that they speak with a man named Joseph Joe Sox Lanza. Lanza was officially a business agent for the United Seafood Workers Union. He was also a mobster in his own right and was known as the records boss of the Fulton Fish Market in downtown New York City. Yet compared to the stature of other criminal figures in the city, Lanza was a small fry, and he knew it. As a result, he ended up telling the ONI that they would have better luck higher up the food chain. He suggested either Mayor Lansky, who controlled the Longshoremen's Union, whatever that is, or Frank Costello, a gambling figure with numerous interests throughout the waterfront. But to get them, Lanza told Haffenden he would need to first speak to Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano, at the Times, was locked away in prison, having been put there by Thomas Dewey. A delicate series of negotiations were subsequently launched in what is now known as Operation Underworld. This operation, which the government was forced to reluctantly acknowledge after decades of public denials, involved the recruitment of high-level organized crime figures for work with American intelligence services, justified by wartime necessity. Not long after Operation Underworld had been given the go-ahead, Luciano agreed to the ONI's requests, and his prison cell soon became a hub for meetings between him and his criminal associates, meetings in which they would coordinate counterintelligence activities with the Navy. Despite Operation Underworld's initial and relatively narrow objectives, the scope of the operation organically expanded. Before long, Luciano and his colleagues, Meyer Lansky, chief among them, were helping the ONI cultivate intelligence for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Lower-ranking mob figures and immigrants were frequently brought to Haffenden's office for questioning. Names and contact information for friendly Sicilians, many of whom were mafia figures, were provided to the ONI agents for use in the military campaign. While the resulting collaborations between the mafia and the military on the beaches and in the villages of Sicily have slipped into legend, the legacy of Operation Underworld has endured and undeniably forever altered the United States of America and beyond. Indeed, Operation Underworld was the beginning of the creation of a new underworld entirely, one built on the cooperation, if not outright symbiosis, between organized crime and American intelligence. Shadowy alliances. Lucky Luciano was born in Sicily 1897 and arrived on American shores in 1906. At a young age, he formed his own gang, which offered protection to Jewish immigrants from Italian and Irish organized crime elements in exchange for small fees. This protection, unsurprisingly, was tantamount to extortion, and the money he accrued allowed him to begin expanding into other rackets, including notably prostitution. Early on, he met and formed an alliance with another young gangster named Frank Costello, an immigrant from Calabria, Italy. Together, the two consolidated their power by taking control of the numerous environs now considered typical of organized crime, prostitution, narcotics, and even organized labor in New York City's docks. As their business expanded, so too did their revenue. Soon Luciano and his cohorts were being propelled to the heights of power in New York City. Thomas Dewey once commented that Luciano's business was far-flung and brought in a colossal revenue. This was estimated to be far in excess of $12 million a year. This was a quote, actually, from Mr. What was his name? Dewey. Quote end. Key to Luciano and Costello's operation was the fact that it had overcome the traditional bifurcation of organized crime into ethnic enclaves. For the first time in Luciano's growing criminal empire, Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal networks intermingled and cooperated with one another. However, this early cooperation lacked the cohesion and integration that the network born out of Luciano's and Costello's enterprise would develop in the years to come. Joining Luciano and Costello in their criminal enterprise was Meyer Lansky and his close friend Benjamin Baxi Siegel. Lansky was well connected in Jewish mob circles, and he, along with Siegel, had amassed significant wealth during the Prohibition era. Lansky, whose long shadow is cast across the entire history of organized crime in the 20th century, was something of a visionary. Various accounts paint him as the intellectual architect behind the multi-ethnic organized crime model that Luciano successfully pursued. Lansky was also instrumental in bringing mob groups into the world of gambling, helping set up casinos in the Caribbean that would be utilized to wash the money generated by their various vices and records. Perhaps most important of all was that Lansky had also helped develop the use of a complex banking network, which he adopted in an effort to avoid the fate of Al Capone. After all, Capone had not been taken down not for murder or extortion, but for tax evasion. This Luciano-Costello-Lansky-Siegel alliance was the basis of what subsequently became known as the National Crime Syndicate. Far from the well-organized image of the mafia, often promoted by the media, the National Crime Syndicate operated loosely at best, and according to some commentators, did not actually exist in any meaningful way. Such arguments might be going a step too far, although they are worth considering. The National Crime Syndicate might be best understood as a social network, a sprawling, faction-filled web of associations and organizations that either collaborated or competed, depending on the situation or the spoils. In 1936, this emerging crime network took what at first glance appeared to be a major blow following the arrest and successful prosecution of Luciano by Thomas E. Dewey in a spectacular, if not sensational, trial. Luciano's apparent downfall came via an assault on New York City's prostitution rackets, which his organization firmly controlled. As Alfred McCoy summarizes, quote, Dewey's investigators felt that his forced prostitution charge would be more likely to offend public sensibilities and a secure conviction. Quote end. A handful of prostitutes who worked in Luciano's brothels testified against him, and the New York court quickly sentenced the gangster to a 30 to 50-year jail term. Dewey's role in this affair is quite interesting. 6 years later, when he ran to secure the presidential nomination for the Republican Party, he joined forces with John Foster Dulles, the brother of Alan Dulles, best known for his role as the first civilian head of the CIA in the early years of the Cold War. Dulles, a member of the internationalist camp of American politics that typified the attitudes of the elite Eastern establishment, impressed upon Dewey the importance of overcoming the isolationist factions of the Republican Party. What Dulles got in exchange for his steering of Dewey in pursuit of political power was his own rise through the ranks of the party, ultimately culminating in his service as President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State. Even more curious was an investment that Dewey made during the 1950s in an entity called the Mary Carter Paint Company, later renamed Resorts International. Mary Carter was controlled by the Crosby family, and its operations were overseen by the most practical-minded of the family's sons, James Crosby. Mary Carter was deeply tied to organized crime networks. It worked closely in developing businesses in the Bahamas, hand in hand with a number of Maya Lansky frontmen, while James' brother, Peter Crosby, was a notorious confidence man with an impressive roster of criminal contacts. It had also been widely rumored that Mary Carter was a CIA front company. The OSS. Lurking in the background of the Operation Underworld, which had seen the ONI directly recruit Luciano, was the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime forerunner to the CIA and America's first robust national intelligence organization. The precise role that the OSS played in the affair isn't exactly clear. According to George White, a notorious agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics who had been recruited into the OSS, he had been propositioned by an organized crime associate to enlist Luciano in exchange for pardon, but this was a bridge too far. An alliance between the OSS and a person of Luciano's reputation would be a very naive way of doing business. White maintained that he felt it was outrageous to entertain the proposition even for the OSS, who were willing to do almost anything. White would make these statements in the course of federal testimony, and in all likelihood he was lying to protect the OSS. According to Richard Harris Smith, an historian of the OSS, Earl Brennan, an OSS officer in Italy, was kept in the loop regarding negotiations between Luciano and the ONI. Meanwhile, Assistant District Attorney Murray Gurfein, I hope that's right, who handled the legal end of the Luciano negotiations, subsequently went to Europe to serve as a colonel in the OSS. The OSS was many things, operating in many different theaters. In Europe, it ran a fairly unsuccessful paramilitary campaign. However, in the China-Burma-India theater, its military operations achieved remarkable results. When it came to spycraft, its supporters gushed with praise, while its detractors regarded the tales later woven by its veterans as worthy of skepticism. The OSS was frequently and accurately seen as a social club. While its ranks did boast a great many military officers and figures from other government agencies like the FBI and the FBN, its leadership in the higher-ranking administrative posts tended to be secured by the sons of the country's wealthiest elite. In London, Madrid, Geneva, Paris, and elsewhere, posts were held by members of the Mellon family of Pittsburgh, the family behind the Gulf oil fortune. The Gulf oil fortune. Heirs of the Morgan family also secured positions within the agency, as did members of the DuPont and the Vanderbilt families. Quote, only the Rockefellers were conspicuously absent. Quote, and from the OSS writes Richard Harris Smith, adding that, quote again, from this Mr. Richard Harris Smith, again, Nelson Rockefeller headed his own agency, the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, quote end. David Rockefeller, Nelson's brother, also reportedly ran his own intelligence apparatus during the war. The agency itself was something of brainchild, at least partially, of General William J. Donovan, a prominent New York City antitrust lawyer and veteran of World War I. Along with figures like Dewey and Dulles, Donovan was the consummate Eastern establishment insider. He maintained a deep preoccupation with with organization and rationalization, which filtered into his work defending the trusts and combines that which filtered into his work defending the trusts and combines that dotted the corporate landscape of his day. He was also a firm internationalist when it came to his political outlook. During the interwar years, Donovan had acted as an agent for various corporate interests and had even traveled to Russia on behalf of the Morgans to collect information on the developments of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the course of his wartime intelligence work, Donovan was first appointed by President Roosevelt to head the Office of the Coordinator of Information, so-called COI, which was intended to help coordinate the scattered intelligence outfits and military organizations that communicated infrequently and cooperated even less. A COI was the seed from which the OSS would later spring. Under Donovan's direction, it became a clearinghouse for military and political propaganda. This was in no small part thanks to Donovan's close friend, a British intelligence operative named William Stevenson. Stevenson was the wartime head of a British intelligence unit in the United States, headquartered in New York City, and known as the British Security Coordination, short BSC. He reported to Stuart Menzies, who was then serving as the head of MI6. Menzies had tasked Stevenson with establishing relations on the highest possible level between the British SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, another name for the MI6, and the US Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stevenson and BSC operated from an office located in Rockefeller Centers. Let me read that again. Stevenson and the BSC operated from an office located in Rockefeller Center's International Building, which was also the home of numerous other BSC front organizations. Stevenson also worked closely with other British intelligence agencies, including MI6 itself and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, which had begun its life as Section D of MI6. In agreement with Menzies' mandate, Stevenson developed a close working relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, who seemed to be enthusiastic about being a liaison, or however that word is pronounced, to British intelligence on matters concerning the war in Europe. At this stage, the US had yet to enter the conflict. Reportedly, the BSC provided the FBI with over 100,000 confidential reports, while Hoover kept the British in the loop with American reports on German naval movements and the like. The relationship between Hoover and Stevenson would ultimately break down by 1941. Soon after, Stevenson began to cultivate William Donovan, who increasingly challenged Hoover's position as the sole conduit between the Americans and the British. When Donovan was appointed by Roosevelt as the coordinator of information and subsequently formed the OSS, an intense bureaucratic struggle erupted between Hoover and his rivals. As will be discussed in greater detail in the next chapter, this struggle allegedly led Donovan to coordinate with organized crime kingpins, namely Mayor Lansky, to blackmail Hoover in an effort to bring him to heel. Stevenson did more than simply cultivate Donovan. In 1940, he reported back to his handlers in England that, quote, "There is no doubt we can achieve infinitely more through Donovan than through any other individual. He is very receptive and can be trusted to represent our needs in the right quarters and in the right way in the USA." Quote end. Donovan's COI and OSS were, in all actuality, the offspring of these British-led efforts, and a great deal of the decisions Donovan made were influenced by figures tied to Stevenson's BSC. Before the COI was up and running, for example, Donovan conferred closely with Robert Sherwood, a playwright, ardent interventionist, and close confidant of President Roosevelt. Quote, "On June 16, 1941, writes Thomas Mail, or Mahl, sounds very German. Mahl in German means something like dish." Yeah, not exactly, but something like this. Could also mean, in another way, mark, the mark of the devil, for example. Das Mal des Tiers. Yeah, okay. That aside, let's continue to quote. Sherwood sent to Donovan a list of people he thought he could trust for the work we discussed yesterday evening at your home. Quote end. At the time, Sherwood was working closely with the BSC even sending them copies of speeches he had written for the president prior to Roosevelt receiving them. As efforts were undertaken to get the American intelligence apparatus up and running, the BSC undertook a propaganda campaign aimed at garnering support for such an institution. Mahl, in his book Desperate Deception, shows how BSC assets seeded the idea throughout the mass media, which in turn was circulated up to the heights of political power. One characteristic incident took place in May 1941, just a month prior to Donovan's meeting with Sherwood. It was on the 9th of that May that, and now comes a quote here. Yeah. Well, okay, here we are. I think this is from the book Desperate Deception from Mr. Mahl. So this is now that. It was on the 9th of that May that Vincent Astor, FDR's friend and New York area coordinator of intelligence, sent the president a clipping from the New York Herald Tribune that was probably a plan to build the consensus for voices calling for the plan British intelligence wanted. The Herald Tribune was BSC's favorite outlet for planted articles. Moreover, the putative author, George Fielding Eliot, was a devoted British sympathizer, one of the most influential people on the BSC front, Fight for Freedom, and a favorite vehicle for planted articles. Citing the threat from fifth columnists and enemy agents, Eliot pointed out with alarm at the lack of a coordinator for the FBI, ONI, and G2 intelligence. Okay, this quote of the book is done. Continue. The idea of a fifth column was a prime component of BSC propaganda and would later be adopted by the OSS itself. It was used to attack isolationists' holdouts against American entry into the war, and was also used to generate fear and create an atmosphere of distrust among the general public. The term originated during the course of the early phase of the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s and was used to describe something like a domestic military in waiting. The fifth column was purported to be composed of enemy agents and their sympathizers with a mandate towards sabotage and other violent activities. According to Mahl, one of the strongest promoters of the notion of a Nazi fifth column active in America was a Chicago journalist and close associate of Donovan named Edgar Ansel Maurer, who was subsequently identified as an asset of British intelligence. So the fifth column, however, was simply an exaggerated threat. Axis sabotage efforts within the United States did occur, but were limited and ultimately ineffectual. Yet this reality didn't matter to the BSC and its American allies, as the promotion of fifth column fears had a legitimizing function for their activities. It formed the very justification and popular base of support for the creation and expansion of the emerging organized intelligence apparatus. It also spawned events like Operation Underworld. After all, it was the specter of fifth column activity that had first prompted the collaboration between the ONI and organized crime elements. Even more incredibly, it seems that the legitimization gained by intelligence services through BSC propaganda ultimately benefited these criminal networks as well. At the war's end, naval intelligence began a campaign to have Luciano released from prison, and at the beginning of 1946, the man who had put Luciano away, Thomas Dewey, commuted the mobster's sentence in exchange for his deportation to Italy. In the year or two that followed, numerous other gangsters, perhaps as many as 100, were deported and joined him. Luciano's deportation was the beginning of an effort to cement in place a powerful organized crime network that was transnational in scope and wedded to the American intelligence services. Indeed, even though Luciano was no longer physically in the United States, he and his ilk continued to guide organized criminal activities from abroad while also establishing new records during their exile in the Old World. Deported alongside Luciano, for instance, was Frank Coppola, the powerful Detroit mob boss who had been something of a mentor to Jimmy Hoffa. The mob-linked head of Teamsters Union. The use of the Teamsters Pension Fund for organized crime-linked financing recurs throughout this book. By the 1960s, Hoffa and the Teamsters were working closely alongside the CIA, particularly on efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro, who had seized many of the mob's casinos during the course of the Cuban Revolution. Coppola himself was linked to American intelligence. He was said to have been behind the 1947 May Day massacre in Sicily, allegedly financed by former OSS chief William Donovan, in which 8 people were killed and 33 wounded. 498 people, mostly left-wingers, were killed in 1948 alone. Also deported was Silvestro Silver Sam Carolla, a Sicily-born mobster who had arrived in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the early 1900s and had become the city's boss. He was particularly close to the interests of New York City organized crime. In the 1930s, Carolla had worked with Costello and Luciano to provide New Orleans with slot machines under the watchful eye of their ally Huey Long. The gambling operation was so successful that it soon attracted the attention of Lansky, and plans were put in motion to establish centers of communication and money laundering operations to be used by the underworld on a national scale in New Orleans. This included the opening of 3 big Las Vegas-style gambling casinos across Louisiana and the introduction of a new rising star in the underworld into this partnership. That rising star was Carlos Marcello. Soon Marcello was managing the whole of the Louisiana casino operation. When Carolla was deported to Sicily, Marcello was tapped to take his place, and so began the reign of one of the most powerful crime bosses of the 20th century. Quote, "It was said," wrote John Davis in his book Mafia Kingfish, "Frank Costello sent his blessings from New York, and Sam Carolla sent word from Palermo that he approved Carlos' selection as caretaker boss until he, Silver Dollar Sam, returned from exile." Quote end. In Italy, Carolla linked up with Luciano in developing what was reported by American law enforcement to be a large-scale drug network. As will be discussed in Chapter 3, this network spanned the Middle East, Europe, and the United States, and one particularly well-oiled pipeline of this network, one that connected Lebanon to Sicily to Marseille, was infamously known as the French Connection. Curiously, Carolla and Luciano turned up in Mexico in 1948 to oversee the development of a drug smuggling operation in that country. While Mexico had its own domestic drug production, it was also a key transshipment point for the flow of heroin refined from opium produced in the East. Here we again find the fingerprints of cooperation between intelligence services and organized crime. The Drug Connection and Operation X. The story of China's Green Gang is complicated, partially due to the mixing of facts with rumor and legend. Yet it is undeniable that their rise was a consequence of the rapid transformations that shook Chinese society in the early 20th century. However, the Green Gang itself began long before the 20th century dawned, originating as a secret society with roots stretching back to Luoism. Luoism, whoever that is, a folk religion, it's explained by now, a folk religion that followed the teachings of Buddhist mystic Luo Menggong. During the late 1700s, This particular branch of Lewism had become a powerful force among boatmen, whose trade was the transport of grain and other foodstuffs. Fearful of their growing power, authorities stepped in to suppress this network, driving it underground. Once bitterly ensconced, is that right? Once bitterly ensconced in the margins of society, these Lewists began engaging in smuggling and formed alliances with other smuggling groups. Soon they consolidated their power and became a formidable force in the world of crime. Under the leadership of Du Yesheng, the Green Gang helped bring to power the Kuomintang, KMT, later known as the Nationalist Chinese, under the direction of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang himself was not a member of the Green Gang, but his political mentor and protector, General Chen Chimei, had been. Between the 1920s and the 1930s, the Green Gang was fully integrated with the government of Shanghai and became a primary source of power for the KMT. They relied on the Green Gang to conduct counter-espionage activities and gather political intelligence, and called upon the resources of the organization to suppress trade unionists and communists. The Green Gang financed its activities through the cultivation and sale of opium, an activity that was fully sanctioned by Chiang and the KMT. Prior to the KMT's rise to power, Chinese opium production was unorganized, distributed among many different warring figures. Under Chiang, however, a suppression was carried out with the ostensible goal of wiping out the opium trade in the name of public health. Behind the scenes, however, the KMT was doing quite the opposite. The suppression of opium production was actually an integrated effort to centralize it, placing production, distribution, and ultimately control of the substance in the hands of a joint KMT Green Gang monopoly. Support for the KMT opium monopoly came from Western modernizers, including the Rockefeller Foundation, which had set up shop in China during the 1910s with the creation of the China Medical Board. Through this apparatus, the Rockefeller Foundation undertook efforts to promote modern science, develop medical education programs, and set up hospitals. It is likely that the Foundation's support for opium monopolization was intricately bound up with the health crusade, since opium had important wide-ranging medicinal applications. At the same time, it was also part of a larger tendency among internationalists like the Rockefellers to seek the regulation and control of the global drug trade. After the First World War, the nascent League of Nations formed an advisory committee on the traffic of opium and other dangerous drugs. It worked closely with the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Board, the parent of the China Medical Board. The overarching imperative of the League's efforts for global drug regulation was to rationalize the production of opium and other precursors, and to consolidate drug refining and distribution within a series of select major pharmaceutical corporations. Under Chiang's leadership, China simultaneously no-towed China simultaneously no-towed, God damn it, what's that for? I mean, yeah, I get it. To the League's initiatives while using the monopolization drive to cement itself at the center of drug production for both the criminal underworld and the legitimate overworld. A full-blown narco-state was in the process of being formed, as opium cultivation came to be the central focus of the government's revenue-raising programs. As Jonathan Marshall noted, quote, In the central provinces of China, especially in Hubei and Yunnan, nearly every government organization has come to depend on opium revenue for maintenance, observed one expert. Even law courts, temples, Kuomintang organizations, and schools are no exception. Thus, in one locality, authorities charged one picule of opium $320 for general taxes, $32 for communist suppression, $3.20 for national revenue, $1.50 for the Chamber of Commerce, $2.50 for special goods, opium, association fees, $2.50 for Hichun Girls' School, and $7 for protection fees. Later, highway maintenance and more school taxes were added. When the opium finally reached Hankou, monopoly authorities added another $920 tax. The original cost of the opium was only $400. Quote end. It was in this context that American organized crime figures arrived on China's shores and began to organize an intensely lucrative global narcotics trading network. Among the first was Arnold Rothstein, who acted as a mentor to Lansky, Luciano, and Costello. He dispatched a series of frontmen to China, Sidney Steyer, Jacob Katzenberg, and Georg Affner. Affner would later be described by federal investigators as longtime friend of Costello, while Katzenberg was a high-level figure in New York City Jewish crime syndicates. These syndicates, according to Alfred McCoy, controlled much of New York's heroin distribution. Katzenberg, himself a Lansky flunky as much as a Rothstein frontman, was involved with a secret heroin processing laboratory in the city, which was refining opium flowing from Asia. Hans Dirks, in his encyclopedic History of the Opium Problem, The Assault on the East, 1600 to 1950, suggests, not that he was living that long, I guess it's referring to the assault on the East, suggests that the connections between American organized crime and the KMT Green Gang-dominated Chinese opium trade more than likely involve the complicity of Western, predominantly Anglo-American economic interests in the region. He singles out in particular the powerful Sasson family. Nicknamed the Rothschilds of the East, the Sassons had emerged as economic administrators in Iraq before organizing one of the dominant opium trading complexes in the East. It is said, writes Dirks, that 1/5 of all opium brought into China was shipped on the Sassons' fleet. Thanks to opium, they became not only the wealthiest family in India, but also the largest real estate dealers in Shanghai. The family also became integrated into the world of oil. They invested heavily at various times in Britain's Burma Oil and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a subsidiary of Burma that eventually became British Petroleum, among others. During the 1800s, the Sassons competed for dominance of the opium trade with J. Dean Matheson, one of the great Anglo-Hong Kong trading houses that has been firmly controlled by the prominent Keswick family. Over time, the interests of the Sassons and the Keswicks intermingled and became part of a vast network winding its way through Hong Kong, Shanghai, and elsewhere. This is by no means ancient history. As late as 2013, the Financial Times reported that Lord James Sasson, having just finished a stint serving as the Commercial Secretary to the Treasury in the government of UK Prime Minister David Cameron, became an executive director of the Jardine Matheson Board. These dynastic corporate structures not only influenced the shape of the international drug trade during the 20th century, but also the evolution of Western intelligence services during and after World War II. Take, for example, the offspring of Henry Keswick, who served as one of the most powerful heads of Jardine Matheson and the controller of numerous affiliated entities, such as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the Hong Kong and Whampoa Company, and the Shanghai Municipal Council. Two of Henry's sons, John Henry Keswick and William Johnston Tony Keswick, served in the Chinese theatre as part of the UK Special Operations Executive. In addition to the SOE, John Henry Keswick served as the personal aide to Lord Mountbatten, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Southern Asia Theatre. Tony Keswick, meanwhile, crossed paths with Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, veteran and OSS operative Garland Williams. When the OSS was still being organized and efforts were underway to expand its paramilitary capacities, Williams was dispatched by Preston Goodfellow, quote, a former Hearst executive and publisher of Brooklyn Eagle, quote, and who had become William Donovan's special assistant, to meet with the SOE officer. Quote, after meeting the British, Spymaster Keswick, writes Douglas Valentine, quote continues, Williams returned to Washington with the SOE's training manuals and helped establish OSS training schools in Maryland and Virginia. Quote end. After the war came to an end, Tony Keswick returned to the world of corporate affairs, taking up a position running one of the family's correspondent companies in London. He also served for a time as a governor of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada. As discussed in the next chapter, the Hudson Bay Company was central to the rise of the Bronfman family, who have long straddled the murky line between legitimate corporate enterprises and the criminal underworld. In turn, the Bronfmans, as will be illustrated at length in this book, would be important to the rise of the network that later enabled the illicit activities of Jeffrey Epstein. Through his acquisition of the SOE manuals from Keswick, Garland Williams played an essential role that paralleled and was almost certainly framed by the higher-level cooperation between William Donovan and William Stephenson. At the same time, Williams appeared to have operated at the intersection of the American intelligence services, still in their infancy, and the networks of American organized crime. In his book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, Peter Dale Scott theorizes that there existed a formation that he provisionally dubs Operation X. Williams and other veterans of the FBN that were brought into the OSS and the CIA are identified as players in this apparatus. Quote from this book, the intelligence mob collaboration established with Operation Underworld did not end after World War II. On the contrary, post-war narcotics operations overseas were subordinated to anti-communist activities, and they were used as a cover for ongoing use of mob assets, above all drug traffickers, around the world. In developing these post-war mob contacts, White and his FBN associates, notably his former supervisor Garland Williams and his protege Charles Siragusa, even while formerly back in the FBN hierarchy, functioned as a counterintelligence unit attached to the CIA, at times the Army. In the 1950s and 1960s, it would appear that the FBN systematically subordinated the prosecution of drug cases to a second hidden agenda, the use of traffickers as agents against communism. Quote of the book, end. This was the book, what was it called? Deep Politics and the Death of JFK by Peter Dale Scott. This was a quotation of that book. All right, continue. One example that Scott cites is the selective arrests made by George White in a 1959 heroin case involving the anti-communist and pro-Kuomintang Hip Sing Tong or gang. White, an agent for the FBN and OSS, who was a contractor for the CIA after the war, had busted a heroin ring operating out of San Francisco that tracked back to these pro-KMT gangster elements, and then subsequently identified the heroin as originating from Chinese communists. Interestingly, White himself had a history with the Hip Sing Tongs. In 1936, he infiltrated the notorious Hip Sing Tong Brotherhood of Seattle by masquerading as a drug dealer, leading to a massive sting operation that nabbed some 30 drug smugglers and their associates. It is worth saying a bit more about George White, who was no stranger to courting the services of organized crime figures to bolster the early American intelligence apparatus. The research carried out by the late Hank Albarelli has shown that White cultivated a protege named Pierre Lafitte, who had recruited into the CIA as a special employee in June 1952. 20 years prior, Lafitte worked in France for Jean Voyatis, the greatest importer of manufactured Chinese opium into Europe, and a figure of considerable interest to the FBN. Later, Lafitte turned up in Cuba in the company of Amleto Battisti y Lora, a Corsican expat who had partnered with Meyer Lansky in a Havana hotel. Battisti, according to a 1955 FBI memo, was for many years known unofficially as the numbers king of Havana. When White brought Lafitte to the CIA, the FBN agent was himself being recruited by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who was working at the agency's Office of Technical Service. There, Gottlieb oversaw the CIA's research into potential truth drugs, which in time expanded into a sweeping inquiry that dealt with the effects of drugs, shock therapy and sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and even more esoteric currents on the human mind. The most famous of these programs, MKUltra, saw the CIA become the largest consumer of LSD, which it used to experiment on witting and unwitting subjects. The subjects included soldiers, patients in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, sometimes organized crime figures, and private citizens. Under Gottlieb's directions, CIA-run safe houses were established in New York City and San Francisco, where unsuspecting people were dosed with hallucinogenic substances while being monitored from behind two-way mirrors. Gottlieb was impressed by White's street smarts and his inclinations towards the other side of the law, traits that were necessary for the covert drug program. As one of Gottlieb's agency employees later stated, "We were Ivy League, white middle class, we were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs. He was a pretty wild man." Quote end. Under the alias of Morgan Hall, White maintained a safe house in Greenwich Village, New York City, where he supplied unsuspecting people with LSD and other substances. In order to lure people into his web, he deployed false life stories. He posed alternatively as a merchant seaman or a bohemian artist and consorted with a vast array of underworld characters, all of whom were involved in vice, including drugs, prostitution, gambling, and pornography. In 1955, Harry J. Anslinger, the commissioner of the FBN, transferred White to San Francisco to fill a vacant post as the FBN district supervisor for the city. This was by no means the end of his work with Gottlieb and the CIA. Instead, he was granted control of MKUltra Sub-Project 42, or as White called it, Operation Midnight Climax. Midnight Climax involved a safe house, much like the one set up in New York City, which was then decked out with electronic surveillance equipment. Prostitutes were then enlisted who would lure unsuspecting clients back to the pad where they would then be slipped LSD. John Gittinger, a Harvard psychologist who was on the CIA payroll, best known perhaps for developing the personality assessment system, later admitted in congressional testimony that the agency was interested in the combination of certain drugs with sex acts. We looked at the various pleasure positions used by prostitutes and others. Some of the women, the professionals we used, were very adept at this practice. This was a quote, by the way, by this Mr. Gittinger. A Harvard psychologist, Harvard, beautiful school, beautiful university. So, White wasn't alone in obscuring the role of the KMT in the drug trade. This was also the modus operandi, however, of Harry Anslinger, the FBN commissioner who served as boss to both George White and Garland Williams. Although Anslinger, like Donovan, was a bitter enemy of J. Edgar Hoover, he wrote The Rising Tide of McCarthyism. Okay, these Irish people have strange McCarthyism in the US and identified China as the number one threat to public order. Since then, the Chinese Communist Party, he claimed in the media and in official FBN reports, was overseeing vast opium fields and had trained thousands of agents to distribute heroin within the West. Per Anslinger, Chinese opium production totaled more than 4,000 tons a year, with the profits from the smuggling being used to finance the activities of the Communist Party and the obtained strategic raw materials. Importantly, Anslinger did not have any agents located in Asia in the post-war years, with FBN posting taking place at a fairly late date in 1962. The claims made by Anslinger in the 1950s were sourced from intelligence provided by the KMT itself, and in the early years by the intelligence apparatus of General Douglas MacArthur's military command in post-war Japan. Overseeing this intelligence, Webb was MacArthur's protege, a fascist sympathizer named General Charles Willoughby. Willoughby, as will be discussed in Chapter 5, would later become a player in the so-called China Lobby, a domestic political pressure network that supported the KMT and hardline Cold War politics. It is doubtful that the misdirection being deployed by Anslinger, White, and others in the milieu was for propagandistic purposes alone. Scott's Operation X thesis suggests a dual function. First, it bolstered Cold War propaganda efforts, which roughly followed the same template as the fifth column propaganda of the OSS during World War II. Second, it helped hide the roles of certain individuals, organizations, and networks that worked in tandem with Western intelligence services, militaries, governments, and businesses in the global drug trade. During this period, investigations into organized crime in America were soft-pedaled, if they took place at all, in part thanks to coercion and blackmail, particularly the blackmailing of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. This also worked to obscure the role of the KMT in the drug trade due to the historical unity of American organized crime with Asian drug traffickers forged in the interwar period. There is stark possibility that this unity was maintained well into the post-war epoch through the efforts of American intelligence services themselves. This would result from the long-term effects of the OSS apparatus that had been set up in the China-India-Burma theater during the war. That apparatus had been concentrated around a powerful unit called Detachment 101, which incidentally had been set up with the aid of Garland Williams. Many of the most notorious intelligence operatives and soldiers who dotted the landscape of the late 20th century can trace their roots back to this OSS theater, and many of them will appear throughout this book. Those who served there included E. Howard Hunt, later a CIA coup master who achieved infamy during Watergate. Another was Chong Sing-Lop, a major player in the Iran-Contra affair. We're only 27 pages into the book, and it's like, well, shattered illusions. So, there was also Paul Halliwell, good old Paul Halliwell, soon to become one of the architects of convoluted shadow banking strategies and a primary node between the words of intelligence and organized crime. It's funny because I've been working in international banking and I knew Halliwell as well, and would also fit this description. All right. In 1943, William R. Pierce, who would later lead the CIA's first training program, became the head of OSS Detachment 101 after his predecessor Karl F. Eifler. In German, by the way, Karl F. Eifler excuse me, was injured. Pierce subsequently became the head of all OSS operations in the China-Burma-India theater. Before it was China-India-Burma theater, now Miss Webster changed it to China-Burma-India. Well, however, and personally oversaw commando operations carried out by KMT troops against Chinese Communist forces. Pierce later reflected on his OSS years in an autobiography, and while discussing payment issues needed to finance the OSS operations in Asia, made a startling disclosure. Quote, "Simply stated, paper currency and even silver were often useless, as there was nothing to buy with money. Opium, however, was the form of payment everybody used. Not to use it as a means of barter would spell an end to our operations. Opium was available to agents who used it for a number of reasons, from obtaining information to buying their own escape. Any indignation felt was removed by the difficulty of the effort ahead. If opium could be useful in achieving victory, the pattern was clear. We would use opium." Quote end. The OSS activities in Burma would lay the groundwork for the country to subsequently act as an essential node in early Cold War activities against communist elements in Asia. Importantly, after Chinese communists drove the KMT out of the mainland and into Taiwan, Burma became one of their main outposts. There, the CIA organized a secret army with prospective plans to stage an invasion of China. Quote, "Although the KMT was to fail in its military operations," writes Alfred McCoy, "it succeeded in monopolizing and expanding the opium trade." He continues, "The KMT shipped the opium harvests to northern Thailand, where they were sold to General Pao Sianan. To General Pao Sianan, I don't know, of the Thai police, a CIA client. Who guessed it? The CIA had promoted the FAO-KMT partnership to secure a rear area for the KMT, but this alliance soon became a critical factor in the growth of Southeast Asia's narcotics traffic. With CIA support, the KMT remained in Burma until 1961, when a Burmese army offensive drove them into Laos and Thailand. By this time, however, the Kuomintang had already used their control over the tribal populations to expand Shan State opium production by almost 500%, from less than 80 tons after World War II to an estimated 300 to 400 tons by 1962. I'm wondering right now why drug dealers here are getting are any problem to anyone. Okay. The CIA's Burma-Thailand support for the KMT was codenamed Operation Paper. One of the architects of the operation was a close associate of Thailand's General Pao named Willis Byrd, later nicknamed Mr. Opium. Byrd, during World War II, had served with OSS in the Burma-China-India theater. Now it's Burma-China-India. All right. After the end of the conflict, he remained in the region as a supplier to the Thai military and police. Whether or not Byrd was an on-the-books asset of the CIA isn't clear, though he certainly was a middleman for moving supplies that had been obtained via agency financing. These supplies arrived in Thailand by way of a company called Southeast Asia Supply Corporation, most frequently referred to simply as SEA Supply. Willis Byrd acted as SEA Supply's Bangkok office manager under the direction of Sherman Jost. You just have to pronounce it German. In English it would sound horrible. Sherman Joost. No. It's Sherman Joost. So, a veteran of OSS Detachment 101. SEA Supply was not set up in Thailand, however. The business was instead registered in Miami, Florida, by OSS veteran turned lawyer and banker Paul Halliwell. At the same time that Halliwell was handling the legal end of SEA Supply's activities, he was also acting as consul for the Thai government in the US. In this capacity, he was closely linked to General Phao and the network of politicians who supported him. SEA Supply worked closely with Civil Air Transport, CAT, the CIA's first proprietary airline. The CIA's first proprietary airline. The roots of CAT were planted during the Second World War when Claire Chennault, or either she might be called, organized the Flying Tigers, a volunteer aviation unit set up to provide support for the KMT in China and China. Donald Trump saying China quite often, very funnily, but I can't imitate that. In the fight against Japan, with ranks drawn from the US military, the Flying Tigers trained at bases in Burma, which acted as a logistics hub for their airlift. Chennault had long-standing ties to the KMT since the late 1930s. Chennault had served as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek and his brother-in-law, the powerful nationalist Chinese banker and diplomat T.V. Soong. Besides his links to the KMT leadership, and to the US military, Chennault maintained an impressive array of contacts. His lawyer was Thomas Corcoran. A top advisor in President Roosevelt's New Deal Brain Trust. Corcoran was close to Halliwell, and both worked together to promote Chennault's aviation plans when the war ended. Back in America, Chennault fell in with the so-called China lobby, the network of politicians, businessmen, and other players who lobbied for support for the KMT as the only viable group who could oppose the Chinese communists. He set up and managed an impressive airlift of American relief supplies in China, with the supply flight contracts going to Chennault, of course. Central to this effort was the 1946 creation of a new airline called Civil Air Transport that Chennault had co-founded with Whiting Willower. Willower would go on to the US ambassador to Costa Rica and was also later involved in the 1954 CIA-led coup in Guatemala. When the KMT retreated to the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, Chennault used CAT to run arms and medical supplies to national Chinese fighters. So CAT, was brought into the world of special operations thanks to the efforts of Halliwell. He had brought Chennault and the aviation company to the attention of Frank Wisner, then the head of a covert body called the Office of Policy Coordination, so-called OPC. Within several years, the OPC was incorporated into the CIA, cementing in place a militarized command structure governing the dark arts of the clandestine services. By 1950, CAT was a full-fledged CIA proprietary airline operating under the auspices of a holding company set up by the agency called Airedale Corp later. Airedale Corp was renamed Pacific Corp, and CAT would become Air America. Oh, really? So, Air America was the CIA's premier airline and remained active from the 1950s into the 1970s. It was finally dissolved into the wind down of the Vietnam War, though many of its assets were sold off and absorbed into a CIA-linked firm called Evergreen International Aviation. Meanwhile, several Flying Tigers pilots went on to create the air freighter firm Flying Tiger Line, a major commercial cargo airline that also operated military contract services and engaged in covert operations. Flying Tiger Line would later have a major presence at the Rickenbacker Airfield near Lockburn, Ohio. CAT's later incarnation, Southern Air Transport, would relocate there in the early 1990s, a few years after Flying Tiger Line was absorbed into Federal Express. The airline's relocation was thanks, in part, to Jeffrey Epstein, and had chiefly relocated to manage cargo for Leslie Wexner's The Limited, see Chapter 17. Connections to organized crime appear in nearly every corner of this web. Take, for instance, Margaret Chung, an attending physician for Chennault's Flying Tigers. A member of the Hip Sing Tong, she made frequent trips to Mexico City in the 1940s in the company of Virginia Hill, an inside player in organized crime circles with close ties to the likes of Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. During this period, Hill became intimate with a number of Mexico's top politicians, army officers, diplomats, and police officials, which likely facilitated the activities of her friends in the underworld. Hill was also particularly close to the Chicago outfit during this time, the significance of which will become clear shortly. As mentioned above, Mexico had become an important base of operations for the drug smuggling network of Costello and Carolla. Given their ties to Meyer Lansky, it is certainly possible that Hill's own appearance in Mexico was connected to these earlier activities. Importantly, Mexico had also become a vital transshipment point for the KMT's own drug trafficking during the same period. Does the presence of Margaret Chung alongside Hill then suggest that the KMT drug operation in Mexico directly intersected with those of Lansky in his milieu? Given the history of Lansky associates working with the KMT and the Green Gang, it is certainly possible, if not likely. The structure of this apparently intricate network can be developed further when considering that civil air transport, so CAT, one of the successors of the Flying Tigers, was by 1960s flying in and out of Laotian territory controlled by the Hmong tribesmen. The tribesmen were a major supplier of opium destined for refinement into heroin. The CIA's covert support for the Hmong is discussed in Chapter 5. Airstrips for CAT's flights were built by Bird and Sons, a private engineering firm, controlled by the CAT representative in Bangkok, William H. Bird. Bird was the cousin of Willis Bird of the OSS and of Halliwell's SEA Supply. There was also the case of Halliwell himself. By this point, he had become a prominent player in Republican politics. He was, for example, a delegate for Dwight Eisenhower as he strove to clinch the Republican Party presidential nomination. Halliwell had also been a leader in the Florida chapter of Citizens for Eisenhower. That chapter was subsequently accused of being taken over by professionals who refused to work with the regular GOP leaders and who are accountable to no one for the finances they collect. Members of this cadre of operations, in German it's called Kader, by the way. Members of this cadre of operators, aside from Halliwell, included Kurt Landon. Not London, but Landon. Kurt Landon and James Guil Martin. Kurt Landon and James Guil Martin. All right. Together, these three men were tightly connected to co-conspirators amassing unaccountable power. Here comes a quote. Landon is a substantial client of Halliwell's law firm. Guil Martin is a partner of Halliwell's, and Guil Martin is married to Landon's daughter. We find these men closely allied by businesses and marriage who, if their plan succeeds, will find themselves in a position of enormous power in Florida and responsible to no recognized Republican authority. Quote end. While Halliwell was making waves in the world of politics and in the world of covert operations, he was also making a foray into the world of Florida insurance. He was the consul for, and later secretary, then chairman of American Bankers Life Assurance, located in Miami. Importantly, Halliwell utilized the offices of American Bankers Life as the hub for many of his activities. The Florida Thai consulate, for instance, was located at the same address as the insurance company, as was SEA Supply. In addition to this important CIA linkage, American Bankers Life also shared important connections, one of which was Halliwell himself, with Miami National Bank. Founded with a loan from the Teamster Pension Fund, Miami National was identified in 1969 as having served between 1963 and 1967 as a conduit through which hot syndicate money was exported by Meyer Lansky's couriers and laundered through the Interlocking Exchange and Investment Bank in Geneva. The importance of Lansky's Geneva Bank will be discussed in Chapter 3. Halliwell's ventures, and specifically his banking endeavors, were probably related to the flow of heroin that originated as KMT opium and then passed through the hands of American organized crime figures. In his book, Hot Money and the Politics of Debt, offshore banking expert R.T. Naylor writes that South Florida is a major refuge for Latin American flight money, which pours into the Florida banking system and local real estate. The flight capital into real estate business is an old one. In the 1950s and 1960s, Kuomintang money from Thailand and Burma came via Hong Kong to be washed in Lansky-related property firms. Quote end. The supermob. The global drug trade is a massive business, and the offshore banking system that enables it is even bigger. Although most imagine drug networks, their controllers, and their users as existing on the fringes of society, in reality, the massive amounts of capital that result from the production and distribution of illicit drugs occupy a central place within the global economic system. Consider a statement made in 2009 by Antonio Maria Costa, who was then the head of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. According to Costa, proceeds from the drug trade were an important source of liquidity for cash-starved banks at the height of the 2008 economic crisis. The amounts absorbed by the banking system were enough to prevent some banks from collapsing. Interbank loans this is a quote. Interbank loans were funded by money that originated from the drugs trade and other illegal activities. There were signs that some banks were rescued that way. Quote end. In 2000, Le Monde Diplomatique suggested that the global drug trade was $1 billion a year business, an incredibly low estimate. Excuse me. 17 years later, the Global Financial Integrity Project estimated that worldwide drug trafficking revenue stood somewhere between 426 to 652 billion annually. In the same report, the overall revenue of illicit activities was posited to be 2.2 trillion US dollars. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, meanwhile, estimated that money laundering activities encompassing the washing of illicit drug revenue and more make up anywhere from 2 to 5% of global GDP, at around 800 billion to 2 trillion US dollars. This, again, is almost certainly a conservative estimate. In 2012, 21 to 32 trillion US dollars was estimated to be sloshing through the offshore banking system. This number would have only increased in the wake of the earlier 2008 financial crisis. When such immense sums of money are being generated, it isn't left to idle in bank accounts in the Caymans, Bermuda, the City of London, or wherever. The end destination of a money-washing process is to transform dirty money into seemingly clean investment capital. Journalist Michael Rupert, in his book Crossing the Rubicon, cites cases where companies have tapped illicit money flows in order to borrow money at a lower interest rate than they would receive from major banking institutions. The conversion of dirty or hot money into credit capital, so capital that begins as a line of credit issued by a lending institution, is made easier by bank secrecy laws in tax havens, which makes it possible for legitimate and illegitimate pools of capital to intermingle freely. Catherine Austin Fitts and Chris Sanders have gone even further by suggesting that there is a positive correlation between the upward trajectory of stock market performance and the consistent ballooning of the track trade. While there are a number of factors that impact stock market performance, such as easy money injected into the economy by the central banks of various countries, Fitts and Sanders write that, quote, "It may seem strange to think of a positive correlation between narcotics trafficking and the stock market, but consider, the proceeds of crime need to find a way into legitimate, that is, legal channels, or they are worthless to the holders. If one further imagines that the banking system earns a fee of 1% for handling this flow, rather low considering that money laundering is a seller's market, then the profits for banks from this activity are of the order of 5 to 10 billion US dollars. Applying Citigroup's current stock market multiple of 15 or so to this yields a market capitalization of anywhere from 65 to 115 billion US dollars. One can thus readily see the importance of the illegal drug trade to the financial service industry." Quote end. Another tactic for washing money is the capital into real estate operations that Naylor referred to in relation to KMT drug money flows in Florida. Indeed, it seems that the explosive growth of the world economy in the decades following World War II opened up countless investment opportunities where the funds from drugs and other sources of capital for organized crime would be socked away. It was this period, after all, that saw the great ballooning of real estate markets and the high-tech industry, along with the modern tourism industry that spawned everything from destination resorts in exotic locales to the sparkling lights of Las Vegas casinos. In his book Power Shift, Kirkpatrick Sale argues that the post-war era was characterized by a rising southern rim that came to confront the traditional seat of American economic and political power in the Northeast. The southern rim was made of the southern states, portions of the Midwest and the Sun Belt, a large expanse that stretched from Florida to California. The rim's ascendancy, he argues, was connected to the opening up of vast real estate opportunities related in part to tourism and retirement, to the oil and gas industries, and to the delirious growth of defense-related industries under the new Cold War paradigm. Sale suggests that organized crime, so often associated with the American Northeast, found a remarkable range of new opportunities in the southern rim, thus propelling these networks to previously inconceivable heights of power and influence. The blossoming trade of opium and heroin, clearly spurred and protected by the CIA, fit snugly into this series of developments. Sale writes that, quote, "Smuggling, especially of heroin, in which the trade grew steadily more lucrative after the opening up of Asia's Golden Triangle in 1948, tilted to the south, taking advantage of the enormous rim coastline and the porous Mexican border, along which whole networks of Latin connections and Mexican connections were developed. And everywhere in the booming rim, millions of dollars were placed in legitimate investments, chiefly in those high-risk operations where venture capital is hard to come by, oil exploration, for example, and land speculation, and in those large-scale businesses where sizable amounts of capital are necessary, corporate framing, for example, technological manufacturing, and, above all, real estate development." Quote end. The observations and arguments made by Kirkpatrick Sale, Michael Rupert, and Catherine Austin Fitts neatly dovetail neatly dovetail with the complicated yet organized history detailed by Gus Russo in his book Supermob. The term supermob, per Russo, refers to a close-knit circle of Jewish and Italian mobsters and businessmen who arose in the corruption-ridden corridors of Chicago and who then installed themselves in California and elsewhere. What makes the supermob unique is that it was a particularly stark and fairly unmasked example of how criminal networks, political power, and legitimate commercial activity mixed together in the period of explosive economic and cultural growth in the wake of World War II. A key player in this group was Jake Avery, who started off as a political fixer in Chicago's 24th Ward. He acted as a precinct captain and managed to swing the dominant political orientation of the ward from the Republican to the Democratic Party. He was later praised by Franklin D. Roosevelt for his efforts to make his district, quote, the best Democratic ward in the country, quote end. By 1928, Avery was the ward chairman and the budding, and the budding associate of organized crime. He forged an alliance with the gangster Al Capone, and the two worked together to elevate Anton Cermak to the mayor's office. On the business side of things, one of Avery's closest associates was Henry Crone, who later became a major figure in the Hilton Hotel Company, the dominant controlling interest in the... a moment. I've lost the line. In the Hilton Hotel Company, the dominant controlling interest in the major defense contractor General Dynamics, and the owner of the Empire State Building. He subsequently sold the iconic building to Lawrence Wien, a New York City lawyer and real estate developer who was helping manage the assets of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, which was controlled by mobster Mo Dalitz, and, as will be noted in Chapter 4, tied up with the affairs of the infamous lawyer Roy Cohn. Cohn was also in business with David G. Bayard, with David G., I will call him Bayard, who ran a trio of foundations closely tied to organized crime and that moved CIA money. David Bayard and his foundations will also be discussed in Chapter 4. Crown's son, Lester, would later join the Mega Group, which was co-founded by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman in 1991 and is discussed in detail in Chapter 14. Henry Crown's business empire first began with his company Material Services Corporation, a supplier of concrete and other materials for construction companies. During World War II, Crown took leave from material service to serve in the Army Corps of Engineers. During this same period, the company benefited greatly from Crown's relationship with Jake Avery. As Rousseau writes, Avery, who had also joined the armed services, quote, managed to become, with no small thanks to friends in the Roosevelt administration, the overseer of countless international post-exchange (PX) facilities on military bases. Soon the military was supplying these PXs with goods purchased from Buddy Cole Crown's Material Service Corporation. Quote end. In 1959, Material Services Corporation merged with General Dynamics, which, at the time, was a producer of bomber aircraft, ballistic missile systems, and other cutting-edge technologies for the American military. Crown received 20% equity in the company, making him the controlling stakeholder, and his right-hand man, Patrick Hoy, was installed as vice president of the corporation. Hoy had earlier been president of the Hotel Sherman in Chicago, a popular watering hole for various denizens of the city's organized crime community. Since General Dynamics' board was populated by a cross-section of individuals tied to the Cold War military and intelligence structures, this chain of ownership and associates is a surprisingly straightforward instance of mutual collusion between these spheres and the criminal underworld. In 1966, after leaving General Dynamics, Hoy became vice chairman of the Penn-Dixie Cement Company, the CEO of which, Jerome Castle, was an admitted old friend of New York crime boss Frank Costello. Avery, Crown, and Hoy were all close to an important Chicago lawyer named Sidney Korshak. The Korshak family had grown up with the Averys, and just like Jake Avery, Sidney Korshak forged an early working relationship with Al Capone. Even before he was officially an attorney, even before he was officially an attorney, Korshak's side gig, while he was in law school, had been to act as an advisor to the infamous gangster. His subsequent law partner, Edward King, was the lawyer of Capone's heir Frank Nitti, before setting off for greener pastures in New York, where he worked for Mayor Lansky himself. Lansky and Korshak also did business together as partners in the Acapulco Towers Hotel. Notably, the magazine New West stated in 1976 that Korshak was the logical successor to Mayor Lansky. Like Crown's business associate Lawrence Wayne, Korshak had ties to mobster Moe Dalit's circles. According to Rousseau, Korshak lent his considerable legal talent to helping arrange frontmen for organized crime interests in Las Vegas hotels and casinos. The Hoods, he writes, needed owners of record whose IRS statements reflected legitimate wealth. The obvious first choice was Moe Dalit. This was a quote, actually. Dalit, his criminal background, and his webs of associations will be discussed mainly in Chapter 4. Another associate of the supermob was Julius Caesar Stein, an ophthalmologist and musician that abandoned his medical career to book dance bands and singers into speakeasies and nightclubs on Chicago's South Side. In 1924, he founded the Music Corporation of America, short MCA, as an umbrella company for his booking efforts. Reportedly, Al Capone owned a secret piece of the company. While this cannot be confirmed, it is true that Capone and Stein had a cozy relationship, with the gangster ensuring that Chicago's bars, clubs, and music halls directed their business towards Stein and MCA. In 1936, Stein brought a man into the MCA fold who would go on to fundamentally shape the character and direction of the American entertainment industry forever. Lew Wasserman. Unsurprisingly, Wasserman already boasted a background in mob circles. He had been the publicist for Cleveland, Ohio's Mayfair Casino, which was controlled by Moe Dalit's network. Dalitz and Wasserman maintained lifelong ties. Wasserman would even marry Edith Beckerman, the daughter of Dalit's lawyer, Henry Beckerman. So Wasserman knew Beckerman from his days at the Mayfair Casino. Beckerman's name was listed on the club's liquor license. Wasserman's and MCA's connections to organized crime are discussed in greater detail in chapters 9 and 10. Soon, the Chicago mob began its slow creep into Los Angeles, moving into Hollywood and adjacent industries. The man who started off their advance was Johnny Rosselli, who would later land in Las Vegas as the Chicago's mob's frontman in the casino business. He was placed in charge of skimming operations, which, as will be discussed in Chapter 3, moved money into offshore banks in the Caribbean that were themselves controlled by representatives of Mayor Lansky. Perhaps it was his intimate familiarity with this world that helped Rosselli become the CIA's mafiosi of choice when it came to recruiting organized crime figures for its covert assassination plots against Fidel Castro in Cuba. Through the operations that took shape in California, massive amounts of illicit money began to be dumped into above-board industries. Real estate was a particularly hot commodity, and the architect of many of the investments made by the supermob was a protege of Avery and Korshak named Paul Sifrin. Sifrin's granddaughter would later marry Lew Wasserman's grandson, later bringing these families even closer together. Sifrin acted as the LA representative of Hilton Hotel interests, and he was the source of the seed capital that launched Store Properties Inc., a real estate holding company whose ostensible owner was a man named Sam Janis. Janis was most likely a conduit for enabling the flow of organized crime money into real estate. Per Rousseau, Janis was, quote, a known associate of mob bosses Longreach Swillman, Doc Staker, Frank Costello, Joey Adonis, and Meyer Lansky. Janis' criminal record showed that he had been arrested for bad checks in Florida, embezzlement in New York, and mail fraud and securities law violations in Georgia. By 1957, Store Properties had bought thousands of acres of land in over 300 transactions worth $20 million in Los Angeles alone. When Store's other California purchases are factored in San Bernardino, Fresno, Oakland, and San Francisco, the estimate approaches $100 million. Then there were the additional investments in such states as Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Oklahoma, Florida, Illinois, and New York. Quote end. Janis, interestingly, was the member of an organized circle of businessmen who helped provide the startup capital for the Committee on the Present Danger, CPD, an early Cold War pressure group set up to build public support for the militarization plan that had been drawn up by NSC 68. NSC 68 was a National Security Council policy paper that called for the remarkable expansion of the U.S. military budget. Naturally, the CPD counted among its members many representatives of defense contracting companies, a field that, as noted above with the case of Krohn, Hoy, and General Dynamics, was becoming increasingly infiltrated by elements of organized crime. The organizers behind this group, this California group, so the CPD, and the CPD was the Committee of the Present Danger, just to remember that with all these abbreviations here, were the movie producer Samuel Goldwyn and industrialist Floyd Odlum. Odlum, a shadowy figure who is now largely forgotten, was the man behind the towering Atlas Corporation, through which he invested heavily into a vast array of aviation companies, film studios, real estate, and natural resources. Atlas Corporation would later gain lucrative government contracts, in particular for its interests in uranium mining inside the United States and abroad. Odlum's interests were certainly diverse. Through Atlas, his money seeped into Hilton Hotels, into the United Fruit Company, and into Pan Am. Atlas was also controlled Conv Air, the aircraft manufacturer and defense contractor, which it sold to General Dynamics in 1953. As part of the deal, Atlas received large amounts of General Dynamics stock and a representative on the company's board. Odlum and Harry Crown, in other words, were directly affiliated. Other associates of the California Group backing the formation of the CDP were a number of film industry figures, including future President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was a MCA man through and through, having been represented by the company when it bought out the agency that had previously represented him in 1940. Quote, based on the success of King's Row in 1942, wrote Dan Moldea in his book MCA, Dark Victory, Lew Wasserman renegotiated Reagan's contract with Warner Brothers, obtaining a deal that paid Reagan $3,500 a week for 7 years. The deal gave Reagan the distinction of being Wasserman's first $1 million client. As will be noted again in Chapter 10, the rise of Reagan to the heights of political power in the United States was facilitated in large part by Wasserman and MCA. At the same time, Reagan was vital to the survival and success of MCA in Hollywood. At the behest of Wasserman, Reagan ran for and won the presidency of the powerful Screen Actors Guild, SAG. At the time, Reagan was also acting as an FBI informant, reporting to the Bureau on leftists in Hollywood. Once in charge of the SAG, Reagan began to change the rules to benefit his benefactors. SAG had previously restricted companies like MCA, that is, talent agencies, from becoming producers. However, in 1952, Reagan granted the company a special waiver. MCA thus gained an insurmountable edge over competing agencies in Hollywood and began to exponentially increase its hold over the entertainment industry. Later, when Reagan secured the governorship of California in 1966, MCA's hidden hand was again lurking in the background. The co-chairman of his campaign was Taft Schreiber, the long-running vice president of MCA, while the company's founder Jules Stein went to work arranging funding. According to Moldea, a standing joke in Hollywood was that MCA even had its own governor. MCA had actually hedged its bets in that election. Running against Reagan was the incumbent Pat Brown, who was being backed by Wasserman and Korshak. Henry Denker, a playwright and producer with numerous Hollywood connections, stated that, quote, MCA was divided into two groups. There was a Democratic group and a Republican group. They always wanted to have a hand in the White House, no matter which party was there. When Reagan was doing the General Electric show, somebody came up with the idea that he would promote GE to the plant's make visits. These appearances were successful. They saw how the workers loved him, and somebody at MCA said, hey, he could be governor of the state. In show business, you go with what's working, and that's an old maxim. Quote end. After being defeated by Reagan, Pat Brown took a directorship at Investors Overseas Services, a short IOS, an international mutual fund with connections to Meyer Lansky. He had been brought to the fund by James Roosevelt, one of the sons of former President Franklin D. Roosevelt. James, it seems, had organized crime ties of his own, and he had done business with Store Properties, the mob-controlled real estate company that had been set up by Zifrin and Janis. Also partnered alongside Roosevelt in Store Properties was James Zwick, who would serve earlier as Pat Brown's statewide finance chairman in his successful California gubernatorial campaign. The Roosevelt boys seemed to have a penchant for fostering ties to the underworld. James' brother, John Roosevelt, had arranged for Jimmy Hoffa to get a job at Bake and Company, a New York City securities and stock brokerage that handled about 25% of the Teamster Pension Fund's $160 million investments. Quote end. The president of Bake & Co., incidentally, was Frank T. Ryan, a veteran of the OSS, who was partnered with the spymaster William Donovan and other veterans of U.S. and British wartime intelligence in the World Commerce Corporation, in short VCC. VCC itself was capitalized by a handful of firms, including Bake & Co., Bake & Co., itself and Floyd Odlum's Atlas Corporation, which was represented on the VCC board by Odlum's brother-in-law L. Boyd Hatch. With this set of ties, the specter of intelligence connections begins to emerge once again. It is no surprise, then, that there is a direct line running from the Chicago-Los Angeles supermob to the networks that were simultaneously being organized by Paul Halliwell. Kings of the Castle. On the 45th page of the most well-known of Jeffrey Epstein's two black contact books are the names and numbers of two individuals from the same prominent Chicago family, Nicholas and Thomas Pritzker. Epstein listed 2 addresses, 5 phone numbers, and 1 email address for Nicholas. For Thomas, he had 2 addresses, 1 email, and 12 phone numbers ranging from his main office number to his farm to his emergency contact line. Under Nicholas Pritzker, Epstein placed the name Hyatt Development Corp. The Hyatt Hotel Company had been taken over by the Pritzker's family late in the 1950s, while under Thomas he cryptically noted numero uno. The Pritzkers have long been a potent force in local, state and national politics. Penny Pritzker, a cousin to Thomas and a board member of the Council on Foreign Relations, had met Barack Obama in the early 1990s, and the future president's political career has long relied on lucrative donations made by her and her family. Obama repaid his debt by making Penny Pritzker a member of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. During Obama's second term, Penny was nominated and confirmed as his Secretary of Commerce. Penny's brother J.B. Pritzker, meanwhile, served as the co-chair of Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign before working to broker an agreement between Clinton and Obama. In 2019, he was elected governor of Illinois. The third sibling, Anthony Pritzker, has avoided taking public office but maintains a post on the advisory board of the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. Travel up the family tree and one begins to find that the Pritzker's family's wealth and influence might have originated in darker corners. Take Abram Nicholas Pritzker, grandfather to Nicholas, Thomas, Penny, J.B. and Anthony. One of 3 sons of Nicholas J. Pritzker, Abram, had worked with his brothers at the family law firm, Pritzker and Pritzker, where he specialized in business law. In the 1930s, he decided to dip into the world of business himself, and he and his brother Jack invested in a string of companies across Chicago. One of these was Hyatt, which would help the family secure lasting influence. As was the case with Henry Krohn, the Pritzkers had to deal with the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, where Sidney Korshak was the labor negotiator. Then there was the case of the Frontier Finance. As Gus Rousseau writes, quote, Jack Clark, a renowned Chicago private investigator, recently recalled what he heard on the streets. Frontier Finance was used and owned by the Pritzkers as a holding company and is believed to be the secret to the origins of the family's involvement with the criminals. Pritzker lent to immigrants 5 for 7, or $5 lent against $7 repayment with interest. It was started on the west side and the Pritzkers let the mob run it for them. This company office was where the mob held their meetings. Frontier Finance was a state-licensed loan company with a number of legit investors, such as the Postmaster of Chicago, a former chairman of the Cook County Republican Party, and a retired Chicago police captain. But curiously, the president of the firm was Frank Buccieri, brother of the notorious Fifi Buccieri, one of the outfit's top gambling bosses and dreaded juice collector. Quote end. Another Abram Pritzker venture was the Franklin Investment Company, which later went on to dominate the hotel business in Columbus, Ohio. It had been set up with the aid of Paul Sifrin, who acted as a partner in the venture. Joining them was a friend of Abram named Arthur Green, described by the Chicago Crime Commission as the brains of all the Chicago rackets. Green, a close associate of the aforementioned James Roosevelt, was reported to have facilitated investments on behalf of Mayor Lansky. Additionally, Green somehow figured in the California expansion of Jules Stein's MCA through a relative named Edwin Green, a vice president at MCA. The Pritzker family employed Burton Cantor to serve as the tax attorney for their burgeoning empire. Cantor gained a spot on the Hyatt board. Cantor would, in time, boast connections to powerful operatives from international criminal networks, not to mention the CIA and Israel's Mossad. Yet, earlier on, Cantor received massive kickbacks from Abram Pritzker after Cantor arranged for the family to take over a San Francisco hotel built by Prudential Financial. Cantor, in characteristic fashion, opted not to pay any taxes on his gains. By the way, as part of the deal, Cantor had arranged for secret payments to be made to Prudential executives. What's remarkable about this story is that it took several decades to unravel. Cantor and Pritzker had put this scheme in motion in the 1970s, but it was not revealed until 2007. Cantor was deeply connected to the world of mob-linked business. In 1968, for example, he was listed as the agent for the La Costa Club near San Diego. La Costa, for all intents and purposes, was built for and by organized crime figures. Gene Iris and Jeff Morgan, writing in the Oakland Tribune, noted that La Costa's original developers include Alan Rowan, who was convicted in 1962 on stock fraud charges, and Morris Barney, Mo Dalitz, who, with Rowan, was part of the old-time Cleveland gambling crowd. Ayres and Morgan then added that among La Costa's visitors have been Chicago politicians, Marshall Korshak, brother of Sidney Korshak, and Jake Avery. St. Louis attorney Morris Schenker, a legal defender of James Hoffa, one man who reportedly spends more time at La Costa than anyone else is Alan Dorfman, the Chicago insurance magnate who wields tremendous influence over the Teamsters Central State Pension Fund. La Costa itself managed to tap into $62 million in Teamster pension fund loans. Importantly, a close associate of Cantor named Stanford Clinton, himself a partner at the Pritzker and Pritzker law firm and hired board member, was a trustee for the fund. Other Cantor ventures were located far from the windswept cityscapes of Chicago and the sunny beach adjacent plains of Southern California. He was also connected to a most curious bank located in the Bahamas, Castle Bank and Trust. When the IRS came knocking on Castle's door, Cantor told them he was merely a tax consultant to the bank. That was a lie. He was one half of the bank's top management, and he was shepherding money from his various clients into its coffers. The Pritzker family itself would later be revealed to be the bank's largest depositors, while a number of people tied closely to them maintained accounts there as well. Stanford Clinton held money in Castle, as did the actor Tony Curtis, a close friend of Sidney Korshak. Playboy's Hugh Hefner was there as well. He intriguingly planned to join with the Pritzker company in an Atlantic City casino venture. Castle maintained accounts for the usual crew of organized crime suspects: Morris Kleinman, Sam Tucker, and Lou Rotkopf, as well as major parts of the Cleveland mob scene that surrounded Mo Dalitz, held money in Castle. However, accounts vary as to whether or not Dalitz himself had money there. Kleinman, whose attorney was Cantor, was reportedly a secret co-owner in the bank. Either way, his accounts in Castle reflected his hidden interest in a company called Carrot Inc., which operated the Stardust Casino in Las Vegas. The Stardust itself was owned by Lodestar Inc., a company controlled by Dalitz. Authorities had been put on the trail of Castle Bank in 1971, after a man named Alan George Palmer and several of his associates were busted flying marijuana from Florida to Oakland, California. Palmer was subsequently revealed to have been a major producer of LSD, mescaline, and THC in the San Francisco Bay Area since around 1968. Palmer fell under the scrutiny of the San Francisco IRS office, which was then leading a program against drug money networks. That office soon discovered that the dealer had used the unknown the then unknown Castle Bank, whose services he accessed via American National Banker and Trust Company in Chicago. Palmer, it seems, had been brought to Castle via Roger S. Basks, Cantor's brother-in-law and a partner in his law firm.